Welcome everyone, my name's Claire Williams and I'm here as part of our autumn series of Feed Fact Fortnight. Throughout our fortnight we're delving into some winter words of wisdom, all about horse care, using winter to prepare for the spring and building trust in the feeds you feed and knowing who to go to ask for the right advice. Tonight we are talking all about fibre or forage. Pick your term. There are so many different types of fibre and terms to describe them. So deciding about which one is right for you and your horse can be really challenging. So we're joined tonight by Dr. Katie Williams from Dengie. Katie is Dengie's technical manager. She's a registered nutritionist and now PhD. So Katie, or rather Dr. Katie, welcome to today's session.
Thank you, Claire. It's good to be with you.
Dengie is known for fibre, but the first question I'd like to ask you is, I interchange forage fibre. What is the difference between those two terms?
Yeah, it's a good question because unlike for, say, humans, we don't really actually know how much fibre as such a horse needs in sort of grams or kilos per day. So we tend to talk about forages when we're thinking about how much to feed, and forages are things that are basically high fibre materials. So as we're going to explore this evening, it could be anything from straw right through to sort of sugar beets. They range in digestibilities and they have different levels and different types of fibre, but they would all come under the umbrella of forage. So essentially it's something that's got a lot of fibre in it that we would use primarily to contribute fibre to the diet.
And so that then leads on to the question, which is, I suppose, fundamental to what we're talking about, is how much should we be feeding our horses?
Yes, well, and I think it's fair to say that we've probably increased the minimum sort of forage intake per day, really in light of the studies that have been carried out. So as we've understood more about the risks of low fibre diets, particularly in relation to gastric ulcers, then you'll start to see in the literature that the minimum intake has increased. So going back 15, 20 years, it wouldn't be uncommon for people to go as low as 1% on a dry matter basis of a horse's body weight being fed as forage. Increasingly now, I think nutritionists and most sort of vets for the longer term management of a horse would be looking for a minimum of 1.5% on a dry matter basis. So that's quite an increase. Now, you may go lower than that for particular reasons. A really extreme obese horse might need to go lower than that to try and promote some weight loss. But the aim should always be to return to 1.5% minimum if you possibly can, and that's for the longer term sort of management of the horse.
And that's 1.5%, that's total feed in a diet or specifically fibre in a diet?
That would be specifically the sort of forage intake. So if you were going to balance that, obviously if you're dieting an animal, you wouldn't be using much in the bucket typically anyway, over and above maybe a balance or a supplement to balance the ration. So that element of balance or a supplement would be on top of the 1.5%, but essentially, the forage would be 1.5% of the horse's body weight per day on a dry matter basis. So that's the important bit.
No, exactly. And I know we'll go on to talk about that because there is a lot of myths about riding horses on full stomachs and taking them off. And so I suppose that's where the whole interaction with gut health and gastric ulcers come in. But why is it that fibre is so important for a horse's health?
Yeah, we've got the sort of behavioural and welfare issues to think about as a sort of primary consideration, really. So horses are herbivores, and all herbivores really function most efficiently on low value material, but they eat a lot of it. So they spend, in the case of the horse, 16 to 18 hours of every day grazing in its natural environment or browsing. So we're trying to replicate that. And as soon as we move away from giving them that amount of sort of foraging, grazing time, we're starting to compromise the sort of digestive process, as well as stopping them from displaying their sort of normal behaviours. So when it comes to the digestive system, then we know that as the horse chews sort of forage or high fibre materials, they actually produce saliva. So the more chewing pressure they use, the more saliva they produce. And that saliva actually helps to buffer acidity in the stomach. So there is a correlation between more chew time and more buffering. And we also know that the more pressure the horse uses as it chews, it's actually generating more saliva as well. So the more fibrous the material, again, the more sort of saliva you will see. So there's two things there: amount of time spent chewing and then pressure when chewing. But also, and probably more recently, we're starting to understand, and we've seen the research in other species, that if we go too low on fibre intake, it actually starts to have impacts further through the digestive system. So obviously dysbiosis, which is the term used to describe disruption to the microbes that live in the gut. The beneficial good bugs digest fibre, and they are part of the immune process. So we want to keep them well fed and stimulate them. And too little fibre can have an impact there. And if those bugs are not being fed with enough fibre, we actually see them starting to look around for something else to eat, and they actually start to erode the sort of mucus layer lining the digestive system. Would it help if I just share a slide on that, just to illustrate it a little bit?
That's fascinating, because I knew about the time, because that's why I suppose a lot of people have started to use tools to help a horse take longer to eat the fibre it's presented with. So whether that be something like a trickle feeder. So I knew about the time thing, but I never realised that the pressure, so the coarseness of the fibre, would have actually played a role.
Yeah, and it's we have limited studies in sort of equine nutrition generally, but yeah, there is a correlation between the sort of the cheek muscle, the masseter muscle, the range of movement they use, and the amount of saliva they're producing. So when we're feeding sort of concentrated feeds, which have been in effect kind of pre-chewed or made easier to break down, the horse doesn't use the full range of movement, and it hasn't got to exert so much pressure either. And it seems to be, certainly in the studies that have been done, that will reduce saliva produced as well. So it's just asking me to upload my presentation, which I'm not sure it did that before. So I'm not sure if that's going to actually
You
work.
can share your screen. You should be able to share your screen.
Just share screen. Oh, okay, hang on. Sorry, there we go. I've got a double screen on, so I'm wondering whether it will. There we go. Perfect. Are you seeing?
Yeah, there we go. I'll edit. There we go.
So yeah, so just on that sort of right hand side, really, the kind of the two images. So the left hand side, certainly as I'm seeing it, I think it's appearing that way around on your screen. The blue
things are on the right. Can you do full screen presentation mode? Which is
yeah, hang on. Bear with me. From current slide. That's better. That should.
Perfect.
Yeah. So you can see the sort of blue cells are effectively the cells of the gut, the sort of colonocytes, or sort of going across the middle of the screen. And on the left-hand side, you've got that sort of mucus layer, which is a really nice, thick, protective sort of grey beigey line on here. But if there isn't enough fibre, then essentially the microorganisms will start to use that mucus as a source of energy and start basically eroding it. And then that means that your protection for the gut is reduced. So you can see on the right hand side, you're starting to see the mucus layer being eroded. And then what effectively happens is that the blue gut cells, as we see them on this slide, start to shrink away from one another. So it's a phenomenon known as leaky gut syndrome, and the gut just effectively becomes more permeable and allows things really that shouldn't be escaping from the gut into the body. And that's not a good place to be, and really just can be easily addressed by feeding more fibre or more forage to try and keep the gut healthy, give the bugs something to eat so they don't resort to eating the mucus.
So why is it that people don't feed enough fibre?
I think the most common explanation really is when you're trying to manage their diet. So certainly in our leisure population, most of the horses and ponies are overweight, and it's kind of talked about a lot in the press. So in terms of dietary management, you're trying to reduce their intake, and essentially you have to bring them off the pasture, and then you're starting to use conserved forages. And there may be times, you kind of, you can't keep enough forage in their stables if they're good doers. If they're greedy and they eat their allocation very quickly, there's periods of time when they aren't consuming high fibre materials. And then equally, you might have a performance horse where the tendency is, unfortunately, to reduce their fibre intake, because the perception is that they've got dead weight sat in the gut, so it's going to compromise performance to some extent. Now we're proving less and or sort of more and more that that's actually less relevant and less important than it used to be. And I think as trainers have experienced gastric ulcers and realised in particular that they can't just keep them on really minimal fibre intakes and expect them to be healthy, the amount of fibre that they are feeding to racehorses in particular has come up certainly quite considerably in the last 5-10 years really. But it is a real conundrum for those of us with good doers. We're trying to get enough fibre in to keep them healthy and avoid ulcers, but we don't want them to put on too much weight.
Yeah, it's a bit of a, it's really challenging because you want to do the right thing, but in doing the right thing and giving fibre, you're actually creating a new problem. So how do we manage this? How do people best address it?
Well, I'm an advocate for utilising straw. I mean, it's a commonly used ingredient in feeds anyway, and it has been for many decades. So if you think back to sort of molasses troughs and things, which were probably the first sort of chopped fibre feeds that we had after mainly bran, they're all based on straw. So horses can easily manage straw if it's used correctly and not too much consumed in one go. And products have evolved since then. So the quality of the straw that manufacturers are using has improved, the dust extraction techniques have improved. So in terms of hygiene, it's a much better ingredient than it perhaps was. And obviously there are products available that don't have molasses on, or with low levels. So there's certainly a wider variety of products that you can access in a packaged form. And also, I think we've seen an increase in the amount of oats being grown in the UK as the popularity of porridge has increased. Everyone's become a bit more healthy eating minded for their breakfast. So yeah, there's oat straw availability has improved as well. But yeah, unfortunately, a lot of misinformation exists around straw. So it was one of the kind of key topics to cover this evening, because it's a shame. It's a really valuable ingredient if used properly, and can really help make a difference to horses that are good doers.
Have you got some slides on this as well?
I have. So again, I will just say.
Because I think people forget that that chaff is straw. And I can remember feeding in New Zealand chaff, and I never actually thought what went into it, bizarrely. I just knew that it was a good bulker. And I suppose the same is the case now. But when you actually suggest people feed straw, they don't. And interesting, I lived in Germany for a few years, and we used to feed oat and barley straw all the time. They bedded on it and they fed it all the time. Probably you'd be horrified at the proportion of straw they got fed, but it was an incredibly useful source of fibre for horses that were largely stable 24/7.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So can you see that slide? Yeah, there we go. So effectively, I think I suppose the concerns come from some studies that have been done, or one particular one by Lutherson et al. And just as you were saying, in Germany, I think in Scandinavia, the tendency is to use a lot more straw because it is a readily available ingredient or material. But the study, and this goes back to 2009, they found a correlation really between the use of straw and gastric ulcers. But, and this is what gets lost in communication, really frustratingly, to be honest, it was when straw was fed as the only or the majority forage source. So literally no other kind of forage going into these horses, or very little of something maybe grass-based. So straw is naturally very low in things like calcium and minerals, so it's not going to have any natural buffering like some of the other forages that we have available to us. And so it's no surprise that there's potentially a correlation there, because you've got that reduced buffering. And what's really positive is that, it's taken 10, 11 years or so, but at least we've got now a follow-up study that tries to kind of counteract some of this, in that, again, a study from Scandinavia, they actually replaced haylage with straw around 50%. And they used wheat straw because that's what they'd got available to them. There's not many oats grown in Scandinavia. So availability, it's got to be practical. And they found no real effects from using up to 50% wheat straw to replace haylage. So they were feeding a mix of the two forages, and they were looking specifically for ulcers, and there was no evidence of ulcers there. But what is I think, very exciting about this research, particularly in the context of good doers, those that perhaps have insulin dysregulation through EMS or PPID, so Cushing's, those sorts of issues, when they used straw, the rate of intake, so these horses were so slow at either picking through the straw to get to the haylage, or so slow because the straw slowed them right down, there was really no discernible insulinemic response to the evening feed. So if you've got an animal that is basically vulnerable to laminitis because it's insulin dysregulated, this makes straw an absolutely perfect sort of ingredient to be using, because you can feed them plenty of it, you're slowing them down, and the rate of consumption is so key to managing the sort of laminitis risk. We're just softening that response or dampening that response right down, and that can only be a good thing.
And so how are people feeding straw? We bed on straw. We're old-fashioned. We don't use any other form. We bed on straw, and if they eat their bedding, that's fine. They tend not to. They're not that greedy, or maybe we're too generous with the hay. But what is the right way to feed it? Is there a difference between long and short chop? Where do people go to know?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to come down to some things like factors like cost. So clearly, if you can buy it from a local farmer and you've got a good supplier, that is going to be the most cost-effective way, particularly if you can store some straight from the field. It's a great value forage for people. So it's certainly worth asking. The only thing I would say, I mean, you can easily have a good doer that's competing under rules these days, but just bear in mind that if it is straight from the field, your farmer isn't going to be aware of things like NOPs, like a branded packaged feed would be. So just that's one caveat to taking it straight from the field. But you can feed it with your forage. So if you just introduce it slowly, and again, a couple of more caveats. If you've got a horse with poor dentition or a history of impaction colics, then talk to your vet about whether they are the suitable sorts of horses to be using this for. Equally, if you bed on straw bedding, think about how much they might be consuming from their bed as well, because that is going to be contributing to their sort of forage intake, and how high you might want to go then if you're putting it in the net as well. But introducing, like any new ingredient to the ration, introduce it slowly. And I would always feed it mixed in with your other forage that you're using, because it means your horse is consuming less at any one time. And what we're trying to, another kind of, I suppose, historical reservation about using straw is that the kind of impaction colic where a greedy pony has kind of gobbled most of its straw bed because it's so hungry, it's stuffed a lot down, hasn't probably even chewed it very much, it's just swallowing it whole because it's hungry, and that's when you get impactions. So if we can just trickle it into the ration mixed in with other forage, it's slowing them down anyway, and it's then reducing the amount they're consuming at any one time. So that, I suppose, is the most cost-effective, practical way to use it in your forage with your hay or your haylage. If that's not right for you, and again, you might want to use a short chopped version, or if you've got a horse with respiratory issues, you want the dust extracted, then you can use straw-based sort of short chopped fibres, which are commercially produced. They tend to be dust extracted, and therefore you can feed them in the bucket. They're more practical. Certainly you can use 1 kilo, 2 kilos, even small amounts is going to reduce the overall calories that the horse is getting from forage, even if you can't afford to perhaps feed, say, 10 kilos of it or something more extreme. So yeah, there's something for everyone. And I've just put that slide up because I think, the maximum is a half, but you can do any level up to that. And as a guide, if you're replacing about a third of average hay with straw, it's around a 16% reduction in your calorie intake.
Wow.
And if you're replacing an even better quality forage and up to half of it, so a haylage, then that could be as much as a 20 to 25% reduction in the calorie intake. And that's significant if you've got a horse that's plateaued and you really struggle to get the weight off. So yeah, I think that's reason enough to give it a go, to be honest.
Yeah, and because it's that managing of the sugar level. So straw can be used to reduce the amount of sugar going into the horse. What influences the amount of sugar in hay then?
Oh, so many things. I don't know if
Yeah, so many things. When you get hay in, you shouldn't use it straight away. You should let it sit for a while. It
yes,
loses its nutritional value. Does that mean it loses the sugar value over time? So old is better than new. Honestly,
yes.
it's really difficult.
Yeah, it is, and I think I've kind of got the top 5 factors that are affecting a sort of forage quality, not just sugars, but we can sort of include sugars in this. So first of all, you've got to look at what kind of plant you're using to make your forage with. So assuming it's grass-based, there are certain species like ryegrass that we know that have been improved over many years to fuel dairy cows and maximise milk yield. And when we start to turn them into forages for horses, they're typically a lot higher in sugar. Or grazing, livery, former dairy farms that have become livery yards and things, grazing on there, the sugar content in the pasture is huge, and any forage we make from that will also have a higher sugar content. So the kind of species of the plant matters as well. But there are other things you can do, certainly things like timing of your harvest throughout the year, but even on a day-by-day basis. So the weather conditions on the day can actually make a difference. So if you've got a really bright sunny day, the plants are all photosynthesizing, they're producing a lot of sugar, you cut it at the sort of time when it's peak sugar, so probably early to sort of mid-afternoon where it's had all day accumulating lots of sugar, potentially you've got a very high sugar forage. So if you work with your local farmer, or if you're lucky enough to make your own forage, if you can time it so you're cutting on a sort of dull but dry, sort of slightly cloudy day rather than a full-on bright sunshine, that might actually then help to bring your sugar levels down as well. And
So once cut, if that's cut with that high sugar level, it keeps that sugar level.
Yeah, depending on how, obviously you lose nutrients in that drying period, and that's why the time it takes to dry is so crucial. So again, I'm not advising people to try and aim for it to take a long time to dry, because there's obviously hygienic issues doing that. But if you could have those sort of grey days, it will take longer for the crop to actually dry and then stop. But in the meantime, it's losing nutrients. Whereas on a bright sort of hot day, and we see this with the alfalfa harvest, you can barely cut it and get it in time before it's actually too dry. And that's locked in the sort of nutrients and in the case of grass, the sugar content as well. But we're usually racing against the British weather, aren't we, to try and harvest and get it dry and get it in the shed, which is number one achievement. But if you have the luxury of thinking, oh, okay, well, actually, it's just going to be a bit overcast tomorrow, maybe leaving it to then. Equally, if you can cut it early in the morning before the plant's accumulated a lot of sugar, because overnight it will use the sugar to kind of basically keep itself going in the absence of sunlight. So again, cutting early might help to just bring those sugars. We're probably talking a few percent, but every bit helps in the grand scheme of things. So worth a try.
Yeah, I think you're right. We're usually desperately trying to get it dry, never mind taking a long time to dry. It's more stressful that happens. So we talk about the genus of plant, grass or cereals or straw. Where does alfalfa fit in? Because is alfalfa, strictly speaking, a grass? I've always thought it's a legume.
It is a legume, absolutely. So it is obviously a plant that will fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, the environment around it, so in the soil, etc., and then it incorporates it back into the plant tissue. So things like clover, peas, beans would be in the same sort of family. One fact I think is interesting is that alfalfa actually stores any sugar in its roots, so it's one of the reasons it's naturally very low in sugar and starch compared to, say, grass-based forages, which tend to be much higher in sugar, because the sugar, any surplus that it doesn't use, it just puts it into the root, and obviously we don't feed that to horses. So it has some funny, quirky adaptations, but that's another thing why it's so difficult to try and make it into a fermented product. So like you can turn grass into haylage because you're actually fermenting the sugar, and that in effect pickles or stabilizes the product. Alfalfa is notoriously difficult because it will buffer itself. There's not a lot of sugar there in the first place, and then it's got really high levels of calcium, so it's naturally buffering and doesn't want to ferment. So that's why it's either fed as a hay, which is done mainly in America and to some extent in Europe, or in the UK, it's predominantly fed as a sort of chopped bucket feed, because we have to cut it early. We dry it using sort of hot air rather than relying on the sun, and then it's a much more nutritious sort of feed stuff as a result. So although it's high fibre, it still has a lot of relatively speaking slow release energy in it.
Yeah, and it is a lovely. In New Zealand, I used to get my lucerne bales off the field cut, and we actually used to feed red clover hay as well, which I don't think you ever see here, but was very popular for protein levels in New Zealand. And as you say, we artificially dry it rather than relying on the climate to dry it.
Yeah, and it can be from field to into the dryer. I've just put the image up because those of us, and there's more than Dengie that do this. We're fewer in number than we were 20 years ago, but there's still some people that have these big tumble dryers in effect on a massive scale. Wow. And you just blow hot air through it, so it's not tumbled fast and like a tumble dryer would be. It's moving very slowly, but you're taking the moisture out in a relatively short space of time using the hot air. So it just helps you to conserve all the nutrients, which is why it is so nutritious, but also it's very sort of clean. It's very hygienic crop. So nothing is ever sterile, obviously, because it's not kept in sterile conditions. But things like, all forages will have a mold count to some degree. And it's why, if you've got hay and you've got a horse with respiratory issues, you tend to soak or steam it to clean it up. With this sort of precision or using the sort of artificial drying, you get levels very, very low. I mean, you literally could count them on one set of fingers and toes, whereas hay might typically have 1,000 or more colony forming units. You might have 10 to 50 in something that's been dried this way. So that's why we invest a lot of time and effort in doing it, because it's perfect for sort of performance, respiratory health, older horses, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think we all know that as soon as we open a bag of lucerne chop, it's just smells clean. It's definitely different. And you mentioned there soaking and steaming.
Yes.
So we're desperately trying to get dry hay, and then we put it in water. So why? I know that soaking is supposed to leach out some of the nutrients. Is that the reason we do that? And is soaking the same as steaming?
They have different functions. So both will be used from a hygienic perspective to try and sort of make it a little bit easier for the horse to cope with from a respiratory health perspective, particularly if they have respiratory issues or equine asthma or whatever. The thing about the key difference is that steaming doesn't really leach any of your sugars. So one of the sort of most commonly asked questions about hay, particularly for those with laminitis, is how long to soak it for, what sort of ratios of water should we be using? So water and hay are not ideal, especially in hot conditions. So if we can get away with doing it sort of shorter periods but using more water, so effectively your concentration gradient is greater. And I think we've both been at conferences where we've listened to researchers saying, yes, use 10 parts water to 1 part hay, and you think, if I'm feeding 10 kilos and trying to scale that up in my real world, all of these things are ideal scenarios. Whether you can actually implement them practically or not is another matter. So as a rule of thumb, I try to sit on the fence a little bit and say, the more water you can do, the more times you can change it in the time that you're soaking it for, the better it's going to be at reducing your sugar content. But there's also sustainability and environmental things we need to think about as well, because using massive amounts of water, when I feel you could have actually got perhaps more practical options like utilising straw as an ingredient blended with your hay, if you're trying to get your sugar intakes down, you have to weigh up all of these factors in the modern world and find out, work out which is right for you, because using a lot of water from the mains tap to soak hay on those kind of ratios is not without its implications.
Well, it's also down to the horse, because I had a horse that we had to feed soaked hay and she hated it.
Yeah, and you also have to bear in mind that the longer you soak it for, you're actually losing the dry matter, the fibre element, which we've been talking about, trying to get your 1.5% of intake. And again, you sit in conferences and we want the theory, we want the science, but then you're starting to talk about actually now you've got to feed more because you've soaked it for so long that you've lost some of that dry matter, and then you're in danger of reducing your dry matter intake. And you're trying to find that balance and put that into a message that people can readily, kind of absorb, take away and implement at home gets increasingly difficult. So I feel personally, lots of water relative to the hay if you can. If you can't, try and change the water so that, again, you're starting with fresh and it's encouraging the leaching of the sugar into the water. And then if you can, warmer water will help leach more sugar, but that's not always practical in the middle of winter. So, it's what you can practically do, what you feel is right to do. And certainly, don't beat yourself up about it, because there are other ways, like the use of straw, which I think is offering a much more practical solution these days.
And I think maybe that's why there is that confusion about steaming, because you think warm water, then you think, oh, well, steam, it's warm, so maybe that's taking some of the goodness out. But it's not really doing the same sort of thing at all,
No,
is it?
it's too little amounts of water, because it's steam, the droplets. You haven't got that kind of, I suppose, sort of liquid for the actual sugars to leach away into. And you look at the colour of the water, this sort of effluent once you've soaked the hay. There's lots of stuff going into that, which typically with steaming you don't tend to see, which is, again, and a real world scenario, the kind of if you talk to the hay gain sort of steamer type people, they will say that if you're going to soak, you're increasing the bacterial load, particularly if you soak for a long period of time. Now, it's questionable how much impact that actually has on the horse, because we've soaked hay for years and seemingly not had major issues. But their viewpoint would be that if you're going to soak it, you should then actually steam it afterwards to try and address all of those bacteria. But again, it's kind of how much is practical for people to implement. So if respiratory health is, you've got lots of horses, steaming is a great way to go. If you're looking at reducing sugar, then some soaking will help. But I'm increasingly trying to encourage people to utilise straw, because you still get that fibre and it's more practical, and you're reducing the calories. It's not just all about sugar, because the two aren't always directly correlated.
So where does that leads into haylage? Because old-fashioned haylage, I suppose, and I know we're talking about this, is a lot wetter than you see a lot of modern haylage coming out. In the maybe 10, 15 years ago, when you opened a bale of haylage, you had to use it quickly. It was quite wet when it came out. And it was really only limited really for sensible usage to larger yards who could get through a bale of haylage quickly. So being wetter, is that better? So where does haylage now fall in?
Yeah, and again, in terms of the sort of frequently asked questions, this tends to crop up with ulcers, because obviously ulcers is associated with increased acidity in the stomach. So do we put something that's more acidic into the gut if we're using haylage, and what are the implications? Well, I use this data a lot from Cecilia Muller and colleagues, again, Sweden, Uppsala University. And the reason I like this is because if you ignore the yellow column, which is from the Dengie data, if you take the hay, haylage and silage, what they did was actually harvest it from the same field on the same day. So they're trying to reduce some of these variables. As we said at the beginning, there are so many things that have an impact on nutritional parameters of forages. So they're trying to reduce some of those by taking them all on the same day and then conserving them in different ways. Yeah. And we don't tend to feed silage very often in the UK, but that's the most extreme sort of form of fermented forage, in the sense that the dry matter is only about 30% roughly. And you can see the sugar levels would have been sort of 10, the WSC, or sugar in brackets, in the hay was about 10. So you'd expect that in a sort of dried forage. But what's happened with the silage is that it's been converted to the lactic acid. So you can see your acidity level comes right up. That's your measure really of acidity, your sort of lactic acid value, but the sugar has dropped down. And that's the fermentation process. That's what happens when you ferment something. They did a haylage, which a true haylage in my terms of definitions would be anywhere between 50 and 60% sort of dry matter. So there's enough moisture still in that forage to turn some of the sugar into the acid. So you're seeing the lactic acid come up a little bit and the sugar drop. And that's all in comparison to hay, where you're literally having no fermentation at all. So there's no lactic acid value. Now, the reason I dropped the Dengie data in there is that really is the sort of forage analysis we do for customers from recent times. And typically things that come in labelled as haylages are actually really more accurately described. Sorry, I don't know if the message come up. Really more accurately described as a wrapped hay, because they've been allowed to get so dry before they've actually been wrapped in the plastic that you haven't got enough moisture for them to ferment. So typically we're seeing a WSC value, a sugar value of around 10, comparable to haze, and really very little fermentation. Now, if we think about this in the context of ulcers, if the rationale is all about reducing acidity, there is no reason why you can't use really a wrapped hay for a horse with ulcers. And there's lots of positives about doing so, because they still are tending to be harvested earlier, so they're more digestible. If you've got the typical ulcer case that doesn't hold its weight well, then a wrapped hay is more digestible typically, because it's harvested earlier and often softer, and all the practical reasons, the respiratory health, all of those things. So if the acidity isn't there, I don't have any issue with using it if you've got an ulcer horse that needs a bit better quality forage going in. The thing to bear in mind, and as you mentioned, when you open it, you are then exposing it to the air, and you will get the potential sort of secondary fermentation kind of process going on. So you've kind of stopped it by wrapping it from deteriorating, but once you open it to the air again, then the clock starts and you will get some kind of microbial action going on. And Cecilia actually says, putting a thermometer in the middle of the bale and just watch the temperature going up, because if there is fermentation or microbial activity, you will start to see the heat in the thermometer, and it's starting to deteriorate. Now, if you use it quickly enough, that's fine, but do bear in mind they haven't got that innate stability that you'd have in a properly fermented true haylage or silage, and that's the difference.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
But yeah, if you're asking a question about suitability of a forage, a wrapped forage, I would get it tested, see what the sugar levels are, see what the acidity levels are with a simple pH value or lactic acid level, and it'll give you a good indication of whether it's acidic or not.
And what, in terms of wrapped forage, it's funny because I always used to think haylage was terribly high in calories and it would create more energy. But apart from what you're saying in terms of the hygiene and the nutritional value, why would people look to wrapped forages?
Timing of harvest is everything. So again, if you're harvesting it later, you'll still have a less digestible forage. The reason that the wrap forages, historically, you'll see the sort of haylage bales in the fields from as early as May, is because you're getting a younger plant, usually grass in this country, which means it's more digestible, more nutritious. If that's going into animal sort of fodder rather than for horses, they want maximum nutritional value from their forage, so that's why they'll go early. But if you're making wrap forages for horses, you can still cut them later in the year, so you've got a less digestible grass plant, so it's older, it's more mature, and therefore less digestible. So typically, wrap forages, it's the hygiene, it's the convenience. You can store outside because as long as they're wrapped and you don't puncture it, it's much easier, and you tend to handle them with machines, and people bring one in and the yard uses up a round bale or whatever. They can be a lot more practical, but mainly it's nutritional value and those sorts of parameters that you would be respiratory health that you'd be choosing a wrapped forage.
And we have seen, to me, haylage tends to be the big bales, but we have seen more and more in the market small bales wrapped.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that is a response to the increasing demand from horse owners, and rather than them just being something that is primarily used for cattle or sheep and things. So yeah, and they are very practical. If you've got group kept horses and you can literally roll the round bales out to the field, I mean, you can get round baled hay, but it tends to be most farmers making it as wrapped forage these days. They're very easy ways of getting forage out there for a large number of horses, and you can even get nets now that go over the big bales to try and reduce and slow their intake. So
I actually do that. So we are lucky to have a local farmer who does big bale hay unwrapped, and I get a supply, and I have a big bale round feeder that I can open and put the round bale in, and then it gets covered with a hay net, and it is incredibly easy in winter.
Yes, and convenience speaks for a lot, doesn't it? Of this, coming into the winter months with horses, it's like anything we can do to try and make it easier. And I think they tend to be slightly softer, the higher moisture content in the wrapped forage. So if you've got an older horse, perhaps with poor teeth, or a group of them retired out in the field, it can be a really useful way, as long as they're consuming it quickly enough. I think that's your challenge with these big bales, is you need a big yard usually to get through them once you've opened them.
And so just to finish off, the other bit of the fibre equipment is increasingly, I mean, we've talked about fibre in the bucket as well, especially in straw chop. We've got a range of other bucket fibre that's available with a few myths around them, sugar beet being one of them. Oh, you can't feed that, that's feeding sugar. So what are we looking at when we look at some of the bucket fibre feed?
Yeah, and again, this sort of slide just gives you the range in terms of the energy values. So there is a fibre for everyone, as we said at the beginning. Forages are those high fibre materials, and they all vary in terms of the types of fibre they contain. So straw, as you can see on that slide, because it's what we would call quite lignified, so it's got a lot of indigestible material, it stops the fibre being so accessible to the horse. And with the horse's digestive system, we've got a relatively limited time at which we can extract nutrition from it. So it passes through, and basically the straw is too fibrous to be able to break down to get much energy from it. At the other end of the spectrum, we have what we call a highly digestible fibre source, or even sometimes it's called super fibres, with something like sugar beet. And that's because sugar beet grows underground, so it doesn't need that structural fibre to give it any support, because it's supported by the soil around it. It's a beet crop. So when it's harvested, it's taken out usually about this time of year, actually, and the sugar beet factories will be extracting all the sugar, or most of the sugar, for use in human food consumption. And what we're left with is a sort of fibrous pulp. And years ago, the pulp bit was left in the name, or it was even called, I'm going to feed some beet pulp rather than sugar beet. But the pulp seems to have got dropped off the name, and I think that's then where it causes confusion, because we just talk about sugar beet, and something called sugar beet, you naturally think it's going to have a high level of sugar, but what we're left with and using in sort of horse nutrition is the fibrous pulp. So I think generally it's less than 5% sugar, because they're very efficient at getting all that sugar out for us to utilise. And it's a fibrous residue, but it's really good quality fibre. So that's why products that have sugar beet in can have approval with the Laminitis Trust and things on. As long as you're not putting a load of molasses back on the top, the sugar content is usually less than 5%. So typically less than half what you would find in a grass hay. So relatively safe and ideal if you do want to actually put a little bit of condition or fuel an animal that has a need to have a low sugar diet for whatever reason.
And I was just going to ask, why would you? Because it's interesting that you've written it provides fibre but not the chew time, and that's what we're also wanting, is getting them to take longer to eat. I do put, it tends to be straw chop in my pelleted feed mix, I think emotionally, to make it look nicer from my perspective, but also hoping that it will make them take longer to eat the feed.
Yeah, and I think it's a key point and a key takeaway really is that there are lots of high fibre sort of forage-based materials that we can use to fuel horses. So yes, it's about giving them that sort of stimulation of chewing and breaking down fibre and the health benefits all the way through the gut. But fibre as an energy source is actually really useful, and there's lots more studies now being published showing that we can fuel these horses even at really high levels of intense work on fibre-based rations. So that's why you would then start to utilize things like sugar beets and alfalfas and other highly digestible fiber sources, because they're fueling the horse, they're enabling it to perform and do a job without having to feed high levels of cereals. And some cereal is fine, but as soon as we start to bring the levels of starch up, we're significantly increasing the risk of problems. Now, not every horse is going to have those problems, but we know it's about risk factors and risk management. So any time where we've got ulcers or laminitis or muscle problems, ERS, tying up, we want to get the starch and the sugar right down. All of these sorts of things become the ideal go-tos for fuel. If you think a cool mix would be typically around 10 megajoules per kilo, and you can see sugar beets and alfalfa are in that ballpark without adding oil and things. So, one of the myths we really need to bust is that just because you're working a horse hard, you have to default to cereal-based feeds. There's a lot of horses that can be fueled for a very high level of work on sort of fibres and oils as well.
Yeah, exactly. And are there any dangers in feeding some of these products? We talk about grass pellets or hay cubes or in fact fibre blocks. Are there any dangers around feeding horses those sorts of things?
Well, I think you do have to bear in mind just how much sugar there can be in some of the chopped grass. These grasses are taken in contrast to hay, which is allowed to grow very tall and mature and become very fibrous. When we take this grass when it's very short and lush, it's like spring grass effectively. There's a lot of sugar, and we're drying it and concentrating it right down into a very sort of sugar dense or sort of nutrient dense pellet. So you do have to be a little bit careful. I wouldn't suggest feeding a grass pellet in great volumes to something that's prone to laminitis, but in moderation, used as part of a range of different materials, then it should be fine. But the other thing about high fibre, very concentrated high fibre pellets is potentially the risk for choke, because they will take up a lot of water. So you'll see a lot of the time it says soak or add water before feeding, because as soon as it mixes with saliva, and particularly if you have a greasy horse or pony and they stuff a load in one go, that's when you can potentially have problems. So yeah, dampening it down, breaking up a little bit before you feed it is advisable.
Does that apply to fibre blocks as well? Because I know we've got fibre blocks that can be really useful for boredom busters if you don't want to put a big hay net in. And one of ours will only eat a fibre block in a manger. And I do think sometimes, should I be soaking that fibre block before giving it to her?
Yeah, I think it depends how sort of what mix of ingredients you've got sometimes. So again, refer to the sort of individual manufacturer's instructions on that. But knowing your horse, if you know that your horse is a piggy type and does tend to sort of come in and take great chunks of it, you might want to just try and slow them down by just adding a little bit of moisture, just to try and avoid or reduce the risk of those sorts of issues happening. But if they're the sort that just browse at it, sort of nibble a bit and go over to the hay net, come back again, it depends how you're using it really. But if the manufacturer sort of puts on there, then you add water. Certainly would recommend doing that and not taking too many chances with it. And it does depend what's in them. And it's a bit like the cubes and the pellets. So do check, because sometimes they're hay cubes, and that's sort of literally the long chop sort of hay that's then chopped up and made into a cube, which I would say is very different to a grass pellet. Now, I make that distinction, and I can't say for sure that everybody does, but just make sure you know what you're getting, because a hay cube, again, is likely to be less digestible, something you might want to soak before feeding, but also perhaps the cleanliness of it won't be quite so good, because if it's sun-dried, all you're doing is turning it into a block or a pellet from the sun-dried version, whereas things that are artificially or dried using that hot air will naturally be cleaner. So just make sure you ring your supplier for sort of clarity on that, because they are slightly different materials.
Yeah, no, I think it's fascinating, the different ranges, and now probably we've got more choice in feeding our horses fibre than we've ever had before. Just to finish up, what would be your maybe top 3 tips for feeding or selecting fibre?
I think a key one for me, particularly for the good doer or overweight horse or pony, is think about the sort of levels of starch and sugars and calories, but also the rate of intake. You know, that work from Scandinavia really does show the importance of slowing them down. You know, if we can trickle things into them, then we can get away with, in inverted commas, a little bit higher levels of certain nutrients because they're consuming them more slowly. So that would be number one priority. It's not just the amounts of things, it's how quickly they're consuming them. I think too, in the context of ulcers and particularly selecting your forage, you know, get some tests done. Is it a true haylage or is it a wrapped hay? Because there's a lot of people with poorer doer ulcers trying to battle on finding, you know, using lots more in the bucket, when actually if they got a good quality wrapped hay, there's no more acidic, it would actually reduce reliance on the bucket feed. And I think probably the third one, I'm trying to think in terms of like a bucket type related thing, probably try to put more emphasis on better quality fibres. You still have to balance it with like a bouncer or a supplement, but the more you can rely on fibre in the bucket, the lower the risk you have of sort of other issues, digestive upsets. It's everything these days, and it's the reason there is so much choice and people are bringing out so many fibre-based products, because it is fundamentally the right way that's going to keep the horse's digestive system healthy. You still need your balancers or your supplements to go in alongside that, but the energy can come from fibre. So greater reliance on that, really.
Yeah, and I think that's really valuable, because I think if we all look at the way we feed our horses, it has changed so much over the last 5-10 years compared to 20 years ago. And I think the range is brilliant, and it also caters to the horses a lot better.
Absolutely, from everything from health, behaviour, welfare, all those sorts of things, it's a much better way to approach it. And I certainly think in the context of, you know, sort of social licence, keeping horses, all those sorts of things we think about in the context of the racehorse and performance horse, the more we can show we're, you know, replicating as natural a diet for their sort of amount of time they spend eating, all those things that are really important boxes to tick. So yeah, important part of the diet.
Yeah, no, very much. Well, it is the base of the diet, isn't it? We couldn't do without it.
Yeah.
Katie, thank you so much. It's been really, really interesting. Lots in there. And I know I'll take away some points to change the way I'm feeding my girls as well. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks, Claire.